Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Natalie Renew, and I'm the Director of Homegrown, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to our home-based child care provider and Paycheck Protection Program webinar this afternoon. I am really pleased to be joined by Gary Romano, who is the CEO of Civitas Strategies, and I'm so pleased that Gary is able to offer this webinar this afternoon because I have scored high and low looking for an expert in the PPP program, one who has worked with home-based providers and been successful in assisting them through this program. And so I'm truly pleased that Gary is able to join us this afternoon. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge and recognize what an incredibly difficult time this is for our country, for us as individuals, and collectively as a community. And you know, we sort of struggled a bit with whether to continue with the webinar given all that's going on, but really our mission is to ensure that home-based providers have the resources and the investment that they need to be successful. And with that in mind, you know, are proceeding with this webinar and are so grateful to all of you for being here with us today and prioritizing the needs of these providers in your community. So we're going to get started. We're going to do a really quick poll. If you take a few minutes to share with us a little bit about your background and understanding of PPP, while you do that, I'm going to share a couple of really quick tech tips for our Zoom webinar today. I'm sure many of you are very Zoom savvy and experienced, but for any that are not, I hope that this will help the call go smoothly today. We'll ask that you mute yourselves while you're not talking, just to reduce background noise. If you want to ask questions, we'll direct you to the bottom area of your screen to the Q&A box. We ask that you enter your questions in the box there. I also want to make you all aware that this call is being recorded. We hope to post this for others who aren't able to join us today. So we want you to be aware and to consent to this recording today. We also want you to know that we are on the ready if there are any concerns or spammers that join our call, that we will be monitoring closely and taking any action so that there is no disruption. I will also remind you that in the top right corner, you can choose the speaker grid or view to see each other. And then if you have any other questions, feel free to drop them into the Q&A and share with us. And now I'm going to turn it over to Gary, who is going to lead us through this presentation. And again, just so grateful for all of you to join us today and for Gary to lead us through this incredibly important information. Thank you.
And welcome everybody. And I'm grateful to be here this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are. Going over the responses that we have to the poll, 35% of you said you were completely green, you know, another 50% with some basic knowledge. So there's some understanding out there, but potentially some misconceptions, some lack of clarity around it. 13% have a solid background. Then there's 2% of you that have expertise, which is wonderful as well. So let's jump in a bit on the presentation. Just a little bit of background of me, as Natalie mentioned, CEO of Civitas Strategies, Luminary Evaluation Group. We've been doing a lot of work in the early learning world since our inception in 2009, but then personally, I've been engaged in it since 2005. So some familiarity with not just the public serving world, the mission-driven world, but also in particular, early learning itself. Today, we're going to be talking about the Paycheck Protection Program. We're going to get an overview of it. We're going to run through the application process. And then we're going to talk about providing and receiving technical assistance. So what is that like? And our focus today, as Natalie mentioned, are home-based childcare providers in particular. So you're going to hear a lot of orientation towards that, and that's specifically the reason. So let's talk about the key points about this particular program. The point of the program, first and foremost, and this is important because a lot of people who don't know the program or get confused by it, because it is a little bit of an unusual structure, say, well, wait a minute, why is that? And it helps to instead understand the intended outcome first before delving into the specifics. And the intended outcome is to keep people employed, right? And we are seeing some of this impact potentially. The jobless numbers that came out this morning showed that there was some mitigation of the number of people who were unemployed, and potentially because of this program. So the idea is that it's supposed to be keeping people employed, not necessarily working on site, but employed. This can be, and again, this is a very different program, right? They're defining small business as including micro businesses, even down to one person. So if you're working with a sole proprietor, somebody who's self-employed, they can apply. They are considered a business, which is a novel situation to be in, as many of you know, with a program like this. And again, you don't need to be operating per se, right? The idea is that the business is in some way functional, not necessarily you're delivering services. This is, the way it works overall is that it's provided in the form of a loan. So the idea is this: the federal government wanted to be able to have that outcome, keep people employed, but do it in a way that had some accountability, right? Rather than just giving a grant. So the way that it was designed was that you would have this loan, you would have an 8-week forgiveness period, right? So, you know, this is the period in which you're watching your payroll costs. We're going to talk, by the way, in more detail about all of these to a point where you may not want to hear anything else about the PPP, but we're going to get into the details on these. So we're just kind of keeping it at a high level first. So within that loan, you have the forgiveness period. There are certain things that you're tracking, certain costs that you're tracking during the forgiveness period, and those go away. So now that debt has been converted into being forgiven. So essentially it's a grant of money. Right now, that's over an 8-week period. That may be longer. For those of you who've seen in the news, the House first and now, or last week, and now the Senate just late yesterday approved a measure that will move this forgiveness period out to 24 weeks. The president has yet to sign it. Our understanding, we'll talk a little bit more about this as we get to some of the forgiveness pieces, but just to provide context, our understanding is that he is supportive of this, but he is not committed to sign it per se. So not getting political, but it's kind of a mercurial administration. So, you know, I wouldn't bank on it changing until it's signed into law. Right now, there's about $100 billion in funding that remains in the second tranche. There was one tranche that we went through, $350 billion, relatively quickly. The second tranche has taken a lot longer. Why? Because a lot of the loans are a lot smaller, right? So again, you can see some of the key points aligning here with home-based providers, right? Sole proprietorship, self-employed can apply for this. You don't need to be operating if you can't. There's the opportunity for this to become a grant and help them get through this period. And then ultimately there's still money out there. And in this particular tranche, there's a real emphasis on these much smaller businesses getting supported. So again, we're talking about almost any small business can apply. Have to have under 500 employees, average for 1 year. This is not going to be a problem for any of the home-based providers, I think. It can be nonprofit or for-profit. So proprietor, self-employed, one person can count. Of course, LLCs, I know some of your home-based providers are going to be LLCs, some will be nonprofits. They're all in there, right? And to be clear, and we'll talk a little bit more about this as we go on, and as Natalie mentioned at the top of the call, the PPP is already funding home-based childcare providers. So we know it can work because it's working. So it's already out there and happening. So let's talk about, again, getting a little bit deeper into how this works. And we're going to go down levels of detail so that, you know, we just don't overwhelm you all at once. The first part of the process is doing your loan amount calculation. So the way you calculate the loan is a little bit different than forgiveness. We'll go into this a bit. but you'll hear it as I speak it. You're not missing something. It is different. Loans are provided based on 2.5 times your average monthly salary, right? So this is payroll times your average monthly payroll. Typically, this is in 2019 times 2.5. That's the amount you can borrow. Forgiveness, that period where the debt has a potential to get eliminated, 8 weeks after the loan. Now it's based on payroll during that time, but also employee headcount comes in if they have any employees, not 1099 employees. We're talking about full employees who receive a W-2. But also rent, utilities, interest on mortgages can also come into forgiveness at 25% of the total. So now we're seeing that we started with 2.5 months of payroll. Now in forgiveness, we have 2 months of payroll, but we also have these additional costs that we can chip away. Anything that remains is at a 1% interest rate due in 2 years, a loan, excuse me, that remains in place. So it's a very low interest rate loan. It is still a loan. And, you know, as we've been talking to home-based providers, we have been very clear, reminding them multiple times that you are taking on debt if you pass the forgiveness period. But we're going to talk about that. It can be returned with no penalty. So let's go into an actual example. So let's say that your average monthly payroll is $10,000. The maximum loan is $25,000. When you go into that forgiveness phase, let's say for those 8 weeks, you had 20,000 in payroll, right? So keeping it pretty consistent to what you had last year. And then there's 3,000 in rent and utilities that you have. Well, that's 23,000. You had 25 in the loan. The 23,000 goes away. It's been forgiven. It's now your money. The remaining loan of 2,000 is now a 1% interest rate due in 2 years. You don't owe anything more than that. So that money has gone away. And by the way, because this is a question that does come up from providers, it doesn't make a difference if they're making money currently. So in other words, you can have your revenue from whatever source, the state, from, you know, other children that you may be caring for, from emergency care, but you still get this forgiveness nonetheless. So if we talk about this specifically for home-based childcare, there are some real benefits, right? This forgiveness mechanism provides some much needed revenue. As we all know, and I know this is an understatement, this has hit family care providers very hard. You know, one of the things that we talked about when this Paycheck Protection Program first started, many of us, including the federal government, thought that it would be a V-shaped recovery. What that means is brief period of time, if we can just get businesses through it, everything's going to be normal on the other side. What we're realizing now is that it's going to be, the Wall Street Journal put it like a Nike swoosh, right? So longer, slower, or even a W, that we might hit another round in the fall and winter that might again shut us down, cause more financial problems. So the revenue is certainly needed. Additionally, another advantage is it's not just salary, but it is going to cover a portion of these overhead costs that they do have. If they do have employees, not contractors, not 1099s, but if they do have employees and you know, some of the family care providers we've worked with do have employees, this can help support them as well. The 1099s, by the way, if they have 1099s, can apply themselves. So there were cases, and we'll talk more about the work that we've been doing, but there were cases where we would have the family care provider apply, and then we would also have the 1099 quote unquote employee who's really a contractor apply as well separately. The disadvantage is twofold, or disadvantages. One is that unused loan debt is a debt, right? So there is some challenge there, and I'm not trying to say that if you are talking to family care providers around this or home care providers that you should say, don't, you know, immediately get rid of it. There, you know, what we found is, you know, people running these businesses are very savvy and they do have a sense of what they need, but debt is debt. and I'm always very nervous about debt. I don't care what size of enterprise I'm advising, debt always makes me nervous. And so, we want to make sure that they understand that this is debt. There's going to be a time where 6 months after the issuance of the loan, they're going to have to start making payments unless they return the balance. Additionally, the forgiveness policy is still being detailed. So part of the challenge is right now, even though there are these loans in play, we have a forgiveness form from the SBA, but it's not clear what the banks are going to ask for in terms of evidence against that form. Additionally, we know that there are some details that that form doesn't answer that will need to be answered. And as I mentioned earlier, we have this potential for a major shift in the amount of time for forgiveness and some of the other elements around it. So, there is this big question about, what is forgiveness going to be? And so it is hard. When we were talking to providers, we would be very honest with them and say, yes, here's the good stuff, but we're not sure how forgiveness is going to go, to be honest. Now, many of the providers still want to move forward with it, but it is good to be honest with all of you about that as well as with them. The other thing that I would think about is how unemployment plays into it. Right now, as you know, there is an additional piece to unemployment, the additional $600. For many of the providers, that could be a better income. And certainly for their employees or contractors, it could be a better income. So that's a challenge. And, we'll talk a little bit about how that plays out in forgiveness, but for the individual provider, they need to weigh that, right? And what we were finding was, in some cases, providers clearly said unemployment is a better option for me. In other cases, they felt the PPP because it kept them open or they were providing some level of emergency care. And in some cases, they would have preferred unemployment, but as many of you know, there's such a backlog right now that they see this as keeping another iron in the fire. And again, this does keep your business running. It does pay for some of these things. You cannot have both, to be clear, because we got that question a lot of, well, if I'm on unemployment, can I do the PPP? You cannot, okay? It's not going to count for income. You can't be running both concurrently. So if we go a little bit deeper into this loan calculation, right? Again, I promised that or threatened that we would go a little bit deeper down into it, right? That pay, right? When we talk about pay or payroll, this is your salary, even if it's just you. So that's how much you're paying yourself. It's wages for people that you have for yourself as well, right? If you're not paying yourself a regular amount. It is capped at $100,000. So if you made $110,000, you can only count up to 100. And again, it's employees only. So you can add all your W-2s in on that pay, but not somebody who's a 1099. And this was a point for those home care providers who do have quote unquote employees. What we were finding was many of them were ones that were actually contractors. The contractor, again, can apply themselves. Benefits, if you have paid time off, healthcare, retirement, those can be added into your loan amount calculation. And then finally, your state and local compensation taxes. State and local is the emphasis. It's interesting that some of the payroll providers created some easy to use reports for filling this out. And one of them actually early on had included federal compensation taxes. And that is a no-no. The federal government is not going to pay themselves that way. You still have to, pay those compensation taxes, but your state and local compensation taxes can come off. Can be put on that loan. So if we talk about supporting documentation, again, let's go down one step further. The best thing for, people who are independent contractors, self-employed, right, is going to be their Schedule C on their 1099. Easiest method to do it. Look at the line all the way at the bottom that says how much they made, right? Some of your providers may not have their tax return done In that case, hopefully they have some bookkeeping. Worst case, they could use the 1099 miscellaneous. What we also found was the 1099K was also acceptable as showing your income. The 1099K, by the way, because our team had not encountered it before ever, is what you get when you get a whole lot of Venmo payments or PayPal payments or other app payment systems. So for a number of these family care or home care providers, payments were coming instead of cash like we used to see maybe 5-6 years ago. They're coming through these app payments. So they'll have a 1099K instead, and the banks were accepting that. For the self-employed, again, that Schedule C is important, even if it's in draft right now. But an alternative would be that 2019 bookkeeping. What you want to emphasize, by the way, throughout, if you work with providers on this, is for the love of all that is good, make sure that you're aligning with what you're going to put in your taxes, right? And if you do have the taxes, let's grab that. Don't estimate. We had some providers saying, well, I think it was around 80, so let's put 80 in. No. Let's look at it, because if they get audited, you want to make sure it can go back to a document that everyone can look at and say, okay, well, these two numbers agree. If the provider has an employee, right, and again, we're talking about a W-2 employee, not a contractor. Now it changes a little bit, right? So we can use the W-2s, right? That's the fastest, easiest method. Those reports that you give out at the end of the year saying how much you paid them. Your quarterly federal 941 filings can work as well. For the state taxes, because now this comes into play because you do have those employees, so you're paying those state taxes, you should have quarterly state employer filings of some kind. You could use the 941 for this. The employee filings tend to be a little sharper. You may have payroll company reports if you do have even just one employee, as well as any accounting software. And I know this is where we start getting into few and far between with home care providers. But what we found was those that did really have true employees usually had W-2s and very often did actually have some sort of payroll. In terms of employer contribution to benefits, if there are any, invoices for group health coverage, contributions to retirement plan, any of these things. And again, we're talking about 2019 for 2020. Another question that came up from providers was, I haven't finished my 2019 taxes yet, but I do have 2018. No, it's very specific about it being 2019. So let's go a little deeper into loan forgiveness. And as I mentioned, a few of these things are likely to change or have not been detailed yet. So I'm going to mention those things as we go through. Again, we see pay, right? Salary, wages, it's capped. Employees only. Headcount now becomes important. So under the current rules, if they do have any employees, they have to be back by the end of June. So by the end of this month, they would have to be back on the payroll. If not, there's a penalty on forgiveness. It doesn't eliminate it, but it reduces the amount that they can get back. Benefits again come into play, those state and local compensation taxes. Now we see rent, utilities, and mortgage interest. Those are capped at 25% of the total. So in other words, if you have $100,000 that you're asking for to be forgiven, I thought this would be easy, right? 25,000 would be at most could be rent, utilities, and mortgage interest. Our understanding from the guidance that we do have in hand right now is that you would use the same methodology that you would normally use on your taxes for this. So for home care providers, this is likely the time-space method. We don't have, again, specific guidance on this yet that says exactly this, but everything that's been intimated by Treasury and SBA is that that will be the case. Some things that might be changing so you're aware. 8 weeks might become 24. The question is it still up to 8 weeks within the 24-week period, right? Which means you could slide it depending on how your state is opening, or is it going to be 24 weeks of forgiveness, which for most providers would mean they'll be able to spend down that loan. It's not clear yet. We also know that this law would affect that ratio. So instead of 75% having to be payroll or more, and up to 25% could be non-payroll, it would be a 60-40. So up to, it would have to be 60% or more payroll and then 40 non-payroll. The third change, by the way, to be aware of potentially, and no clarity on how this would actually play out, is those loans may go to 5-year 1% loans. So if there is money left over, it would be a longer payback period, but it's unclear as to how that would happen. So some other key points. One, there are no penalties or fees if they pay off the loan early. So that's an important point if they don't want to have that debt. No collateral or personal guarantee is required. The banks, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, do occasionally ask about credit, right? And they will do what's basically a higher level credit check. It's not a full check of your credit, so it doesn't impact you, but it does make some providers very anxious. And they do ask, I had one provider say to me, I just paid off my house. I'm close to retiring. Am I going to have to put debt against my house again? No, because the federal government is guaranteeing that you will pay this. So you don't need that. Payments are deferred for the first 6 months, so they don't have to pay. But at the end of those 6 months, what's left of that loan will have to be paid back at a 1% fixed rate. So in terms of application, you'll see there's a form that the SBA has. They now finally have it in multiple languages. That's very simple. The hard part is really on the documentation side, right? Making sure everything lines up. The challenge is the way this particular program was implemented is that you don't use that form most of the time. 99% of the time, since you're applying through a bank, you have to use their online website. So even though the application, for example, can be found in Spanish and other languages, the bank portals are not. The bank portals are English only. So that could be a tremendous challenge. And it's important to know that each bank has a slightly different way of doing that. So even though the SBA created one simple form, each bank does a little bit of a variation on what they want to show evidence for that form and how they play out those questions. And there's a real game around the banks as well. So one of the things that we found in working with home-based childcare providers was that, initially when this program first came out, everyone said, go to your bank, your current bank. And we were finding that these providers, a number of them did have business accounts, probably more than I would have thought, but certainly not all of them. And they tended not to be with local community banks as some people perceive they would be. They were actually with very large banks like Bank of America, Wells Fargo, et cetera. Those banks, for you to apply for the PPP, required an account, typically a business account. So if you imagine like a funnel, your providers at the top, now suddenly a whole bunch of them can't apply to their own bank because they don't have a business account, right? And then on top of it, for better or worse, the banks, and I can go into the mechanics of it anytime anyone wants, you can give me a call or shoot me an email, go into the mechanics of it. But basically the key financial incentives for the banks were stripped out. And I'm not going boo-hoo large banks. I'm just saying, point of fact, the financial incentive that was in there for them was removed largely. So they moved this really slowly, and they still are moving it very slowly. There were some community banks set aside. Again, what we were finding was for our home care providers, they weren't accessing that. They didn't have accounts with the community banks already. CDFIs are now coming online. They just got a $10 billion set aside of the $100 billion that remains. So now it's 90 for all the other banks, 10 for CDFIs. I've heard it's been kind of patchy. Not all of them are doing it. Certainly it may be an option. I feel like they're still getting their speed going at this point. What we found were, as one person who we talked to about the situation said, the heroes of the PPP for home-based childcare providers were fintechs, financial technology companies. So for the first tranche of money, the first couple of weeks, fintechs were not allowed, and then they were. they came in pretty fast, and their financial incentive, whereas the big banks looked at the financial incentive for processing loans and said, wow, that's so little, the fintechs had processes to move things fast. So they decided to make this a volume business. They wanted to grab as many as they could. The other thing the fintechs did was some of them, like Fundera, aren't actually a bank themselves, but connect you with other banks. So they're basically doing your application, making sure you're eligible, and then connecting you with a bank and saying, bank, give us a cut of the fee, and we'll give you somebody who is ready to go. You need to do nothing but write the check. So some of these have connected people with community banks, for example, which had their own set aside. So these fintechs have tended to go faster. What we found is, and this is in order of what we observed, Fundera, PayPal, believe it or not, Funding Circle. Kabbage was really the fastest and would have been top of the list a couple of weeks ago. But what we found is they've started to have some problems. They're sometimes moving too fast, and especially with smaller providers that may not have as much data. They've been offering them lower loans to just get it done. And, you do have an option where you can go to another bank potentially, et cetera, but it's really disheartening. And so a lot of people will just take a lower loan. Wasn't a whole lot of them, but it does make me have pause about recommending Kabbage. The other thing I should say, by the way, is that you can apply to as many banks as you want. You can only get one loan. And that's actually enforced by the SBA, because when a bank gets through, let's say Natalie's application gets through first by PayPal, even though she's put it into Fundera, Funding Circle, and Kabbage, soon as PayPal says, we've claimed Natalie, she gets a number in the SBA system, and nobody else can have a number associated with her social security number or her EIN if she has a corporation. So in other words, one of the other strategies to consider here is, we always recommend apply to all of these fintechs. Apply to your own bank if you want, right? Apply to as many as you want, because it's better to have more than one horse in the race, especially because they all work a little differently and they have different speeds. So status of the program, again, $100 billion remains. So there's a fair amount of money there. Right now we are not seeing, the program theoretically goes through the end of the calendar year. We're not seeing anyone say, end this early, right? And what we are starting to see is that the forgiveness period, as I mentioned, we're starting to get a trickle. So we're getting some more certainty around the forgiveness period. Still not defined, but we're getting there. So remember, for your home-based provider, this benefit is real, right? The banks are going to have requirements, or are going to have their requirements. They're going to vary in speed. We're still figuring out the forgiveness process. So if you do want to advise home-based providers about this program, I would keep up to date. I would make sure that you're ready to give them some more information as it emerges. So let's talk a little bit about how you do work with home care providers if you want to. So what we know is this. We know that home care providers definitely need your help. Navigating the process, navigating the process with your banks is not easy to do, right? As I mentioned, the form, the actual application, very simple. Making sure you have all the evidence that a given bank wants to have, not so simple. And especially when the banks are doing this in English only. Typically, home care providers lack the knowledge, right? They may not know some of their forms. Like if you say a Schedule C to a lot of small business owners, they'll know what you're talking about. A lot of home care providers don't. And that's not a slam. That's not a criticism. It's a point of fact. The technology may not be there. They may not have an accounting system. And also, what we found was they also may lack the confidence of even applying. We had so many home care providers tell us that I'm just not a business. And so you have to build up that confidence, right? You're going to have to, help them with some of that, or they need some help with some of the paperwork, right? So should, in this case, I use a 1099, right? Which one? Is it okay if I use 1099K? again, they often lack that data and business acumen. So if you do talk to them about, here's what counts, right? As an employee, for example, so no, the person you're paying in cash, don't put them on here, right? The contractor, don't put them on here, right? So they do need some of that support. And we know this because of some of the work that we've been doing in New Jersey. So starting April 2nd, and this is where our knowledge base comes from, we were very rapidly engaged by a consortium of 4 funders to provide technical assistance in Essex, Passaic, and Mercer counties, New Jersey. And these were for both home care, home-based childcare providers, but also centers. In all, we provided technical assistance successfully to 92 providers. We're working on 93 as we speak. They were roughly half and half, home versus center. And those, we're defining the technical assistance. We worked with more than that, but those are 92 who went into the application process with a bank successfully. As Natalie mentioned, and this is not my boasting, but from all accounts that we've heard from, you know, wonderful national leaders like Natalie, from the Federal Reserve Bank in Philadelphia, from some members of Congress that we've spoken to, this is one of the most successful efforts nationally in working with small businesses. And in these areas, these 3 counties, primarily we were working with subsidy care providers. The results so far is that there's $2.2 million over that in loan money that's already been put in the hands of these providers through this effort. So I say all of that to say, you know, this is, you know, something we've been doing very deeply. Our team has been doing very deeply for the past couple of months, and continue to do. And it also gave us some time to work out the kinks out of a process. And that's part of what we're going to be sharing with you as we move into this segment, right? What did we find some of the basic TA requirements? If you do want to do this with some of your providers, one, you have to have a passion for it. You're going to have providers ask you the same questions multiple times because they're not confident. They're going to call you at all hours. You know, I was doing TA with one provider at 8:20 on a Sunday morning because that was the time her husband could watch the kids, you know? So you have to have a passion if you go into this. It's a tough time for everybody. I recognize that, but it's especially a tough time for these providers. You have to have some understanding of the PPP process. And we've talked about that to a large degree. And you need to be able to build trust over time. You know, one of the things when people asked us why we thought this effort was successful versus some of the ones that were less successful, it's that we were able to take the time to do it. It wasn't a transactional thing of show up at the library or the community center with your shoebox of stuff and we're going to do it in 1 hour, right? But rather it was an education process of sharing, this is how you do it. This is the program, helping them understand and gain confidence in themselves, but also that this government program may benefit them and is worth the time to invest in it. And then of course, helping them through the process and knowing that it is potentially iterative. So, you know, if you talk about the TA process that we've done, and we do have a toolkit with forms available. I think they're going to be sharing the exact web address and it'll also be emailed out. And that toolkit has links within it to all the forms. So they're at the end of the toolkit in PDF form, but if you want like a Word version, hit the links and it'll bring you up the Word version in English and Spanish. So the way we provided TA was, you know, we helped providers, you know, we first learned about the PPP ourselves and continuously learned about it. Then we shared that information with providers. We had an intake questionnaire, and that was about helping the providers start to get some basic information. So, you know, what are some of the very simple things like their contact information, most basically, but some of the other key questions, you'll see this in the toolkit, that will help you when you do sit down and talk to them, be ready for it. It also is kind of important because it does set up the provider having some sweat equity in it from the beginning, right? They've already done something and activated. which can be very helpful in starting to build their confidence and interests. We then would review that intake questionnaire and schedule a call with them. And, very typically, because of the technology barrier, this was by phone. In some cases, it was by Zoom or FaceTime. But, usually we were trying to talk them through it because that technology barrier. And it was important to talk them through it for two reasons. One is, actually three. One is going back to the share information. We found on those calls it was important to review the program one more time in most cases. Again, there's a lack of confidence. There's a lack of a sense of this is right for me. So many times providers just want to hear it one more time to make sure they understood it. And that's really fair. I don't want to make it sound like that's annoying or a problem or anything, quite the opposite. This goes back to the passion. You have to be ready to say, if I have to say this 100 times, that's worth it because they should be an informed consumer. Second, what that does is it gives you a chance to walk through their actual answers and say, okay, here's how we're going to calculate this loan amount and help you with the application. But then the third is it also gives you a chance to kind of proof those numbers and to ask questions about them. Again, I'm not saying this in terms of with all the people we spoke to, not one of them do I think was engaged in fraud, any sort of abuse of the system, any of these things that you're hearing, like the Shake Shack incident, right, where it seems all kind of dodgy. The people we spoke to were honest, hardworking people who may not fully understand the numbers they're looking at and may not fully understand that, these are auditable. So part of that call is very important to review those numbers. So for example, and you'll see this in the toolkit, one of the things that we very quickly flagged was anything that was a whole number, right? So there was one provider I was talking to who wrote down that she had an income of $90,000. Well, that's awfully level, right? And it could be in some cases, and we could always talk about the permutations where that could be the case, but chances are for a home-based provider, that's not correct. And so we did ask about it. And when I asked her about it, what I heard was, well, let me unpack the number. I did this, this, and this. Well, some of those things are not allowable. Oh, okay. So now the number's lower, but I still don't see how you got up to 90. And this person said, well, I rounded up. And, again, nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying, that in any sort of negative way, but just saying that that's what she did. And that would be a real problem if, gosh forbid, she got audited, right? So again, that call becomes a real pivotal moment. And many times, to be clear, that call is going to be calls, multiple ones. I would say there were certainly a number of them. And we wrote a report of the work that we did that there's a link to it in the toolkit if you want to kind of learn more about some of that experience. But, a number of them required more than one effort. They had to come back to us. They would say, Gary, I don't have all of that. Now I understand it. Can I get back to you? Absolutely. Get back to us, right? The final stage is that we do recommend that you continue to advise them and follow up with them. So this doesn't necessarily mean that you have to hold their hand through every single part of the process, but start thinking about as we find out more about the loan forgiveness piece, can you email them? Now that you have their contact information, can you reach out to them and say, did you get the loan? Sometimes they would have a problem with a bank. And when we were following up with them, it would be as simple as, okay, you got rejected from Bank of America, or Bank of America still hasn't gotten back to you. Which other banks did you apply to? Oh, none? Okay, here's a list of financial technology companies. Get right on them. And bam. And there was one example, it was exactly that. It was actually Wells Fargo. They had not responded. The person put it in within a week, basically. They had heard back from PayPal. So being able to have some connection with them, making sure that they did get that all into the bank, that they have heard back, that they, once they do have that loan, that they at least have some basics around forgiveness. And as the process stands now, the toolkit does include like a basic sheet that you could share in English and Spanish on what forgiveness stands, where it stands now, currently. But that's an important part of it as well. Again, some tips. You've heard me say it like 1,000 times because it was really difficult. We have I expected far more providers to have cash employees or being paid cash to folks than have contractors. So many 1099 contractors, and they kept calling them employees. And it was a real important point to make with them and explain to them, technically it's a contractor. They're not your employee. You're not paying employment taxes on them. It's also a different situation for the 1099 contractor as well, because they don't have the full benefits of employees. That's a whole nother conversation we can have. Healthcare and benefits need to be formal. And it's worth, again, when you have that call with them, if they put down healthcare benefits, what was that? Do you have some receipts associated with that? Because very often what it is it's, I had this surgery, I had that surgery, I have money on my credit card. That's absolutely valid, but not for this program. Again, going over forgiveness with them, making sure they understand that it's going to be a little different when they hit the forgiveness period, and that's going to be important that they really keep an eye on it. And then finally, it should align with 2019 taxes. If you haven't put them in yet, make sure it's in lockstep. You don't want to have something where you're going to have two federal documents that are not aligned. So some real quick next steps. Move swiftly. Again, we have the 100 billion there. It's still going, but providers need your help. They are really suffering. If there's nothing we learned from the conversations that we had in New Jersey, is that people are having a hard time. And I know you know that. Grab one of the toolkits. Again, Homegrown Childcare will provide a link for you that you can get to get it immediately. They'll email it out. Let us know what you're doing. If you use this, I think so many times there are toolkits where it goes out there, people use them, and there's no feedback loop, right? So an organization like Homegrown Childcare doesn't know, was this helpful or wasn't it? So tell us what you're doing. And certainly if you have questions, our firm has set up just a general ppp@civstrat.com, civstrat.com. If you have questions, shoot them to us. If we can answer them, easily by email, we will. If you need a call, we're always up for a brief call to help you out. Ultimately, at the end of the day, when we talk about passionate, this is something I'm passionate about as the business's owner, and something that our team is passionate about because we know how much these providers need this help. So with that, I was going to open us up for some questions that we may have. I know we have about 12 minutes or so, but
Great.
Just wanted to open that up.
Great. This is Natalie, and I'm just going to read a couple of questions for Gary from the chat box. So the first question I'm going to read is from Autumn, who asked if a provider has already applied for and received the economic disaster relief loan through the SBA, can she qualify for the PPP?
Excellent question. Yes, you can qualify for the PPP. So one of the application questions that you're going to see is, did they get an EIDL loan, right? And what'll happen is this. So one, can you apply? Yes, you can. Two, what happens is that comes off your forgiveness. So let's say a person had a $2,000 EIDL loan. They have the cash in pocket. You actually have to report it, by the way. I should say it that way. When they put their PPP in, they're going to have to report it. When they get their forgiveness, let's say they get $4,000 in forgiveness. Well, the federal government says, we already gave you $2,000 with the EIDL loan, so we're only going to forgive that specific amount. And I should say that the $2,000 from the EIDL would come off your loan amount before it's even given to you. So essentially, it goes away before you get your loan entirely. So that way you're not kind of double counting the money.
Great. Thanks, Gary. Here's another question. Can I use PPP money for credit card or car loan interest? No.
So here's one of the things that comes up a lot if you're working with home-based childcare providers or anyone, right, is that exact question. It's a great question, to be clear. Most loans, the way they work, even if it's like an SBA loan, is that once the loan is issued, you can do what you want with it. This loan by statute is limited to payroll, rent, utilities, mortgage interest. So, you know, even if you do have debt, consumer debt, or even business related debt, unfortunately, you can't pay that off with this.
Great. So the next question is, can I spend PPP money on payroll when I'm now at full enrollment? So my understanding is if I'm operating business as usual, can I get PPP and use those dollars for payroll?
Absolutely. And in fact, that's really the best opportunity, because what's happening is, because you still have your income coming in, now you have this PPP money, which is covering likely your greatest cost, which is staff. So now you have the opportunity to build up a reserve. And you know, part of what we've been talking about with providers is, if we go back to the beginning of this call, we were expecting this in terms of recovery. It may be this longer, or it may be this. And so this is a great opportunity to say, now we're ready for the next one. So again, whether you're a provider or working with them, this is exactly like, this is the best case scenario.
Great. So the next question is for an assistant who works for a family child care provider. If the owner received PPP, can the assistant still be eligible to apply for unemployment?
That's a great question. So the individual, so as we talked about, to get that full benefit of the forgiveness, you do need to bring back your head count. So let's assume this person's not a 1099, because that would make them not an employee. That's a totally different problem. Let's assume they're a W-2 employee, that receptionist. So, you know, if you didn't bring her back on, you would likely get less forgiveness. The one out you have is, if somebody is on unemployment and you write them a letter and they write you back, like if I write Natalie and say, Natalie, your job is back open, and she writes me back and says, Gary, I ain't coming, you can get out of it with the federal government. The gray area is, do you then have to report them to unemployment? That's unclear. So it's not an issue that's unfortunately very easy to navigate in terms of the benefits for your particular employee.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask a really short, quick one and then go to a more detailed question. So this question is, can a provider that is undocumented apply for PPP?
No. Unfortunately, no, they cannot. And, you know, even having a green card is kind of a gray area. Some of the banks rejected, some of them did not, even though by statute it doesn't define it. But if you are undocumented, it does clearly say you do have to in some way be documented.
Okay, thank you, Gary. This question is from Tom Copeland. As many of these questions has been an expert in his own right. Can a provider include in PPP forgivable expenses contributions to her own health insurance premium or retirement? In this case, she does not have an employee.
So if it's a single individual, we're still waiting for some clarification on the forgiveness piece, right? But if we go to the forgiveness piece for individuals and their compensation, they are likely to be using a single formula, which will make it easier. But what it will mean is you will likely not get those benefits included. However, again, this is a gray area that we've been waiting for some clarification on. So I wish I had a better answer, Tom. Sorry.
Great. Another quick question, can a provider use the PPP dollars to pay herself?
Yes, absolutely. And again, you know, that formula that they're looking at, that the SBA is looking at, would actually make it very easy, because all they would have to do is document what they made in 2019, and they would get 8 50-seconds of it. So 8 weeks worth of that pay would just hit them essentially on forgiveness. What I would recommend though is, we were telling providers, is because it is unclear, if you have a provider you're advising and they go into that, they normally don't have a formal payroll system, write a check to yourself every week. Have something documented that says, I did this. There's no reason why we're seeing that the Fed would want that right now, but the Fed's been so squirrely about this, I would do it anyway.
Great. So I just want to make a couple of quick announcements because we're coming to the end of our time. I want to just share with the folks on the call that next week on both June 8th and June 11th, we will have webinars simulcast in English and Spanish specifically for providers, and really encourage you to invite providers to join us for those conversations with Gary and his team. I will also point you to the chat box where Sam has linked to the toolkit with all the materials that Gary described during our conversation, so you can pull up those tools and take a look at them. And with that, I'm going to close this out with one more question. Again, there's the PPP at Civitas Civstat email, and you can also email your questions to Homegrown. And we, hope to see you on some of our future webinars. And so, Gary, I'm going to give you one last question and let you kind of close us out for today. So this is another question from Tom. If my PPP money is $200 a week and that amount still qualifies me for unemployment, why can't I have both?
I mean, it's by statute is what they've done. And so, I would tend to agree with you, right? Why can't you theoretically be running a business, have limited income, and then have it come off your unemployment? But these are the rules that if they're not in the statute, at least I'd have to double check. We're set up by Treasury or SBA, but it is clear that you cannot be on unemployment. And the reason, by the way, kind of at a high level, goes back to what I said at the beginning. This is about reducing unemployment numbers. So if you're on the unemployment rolls, it's not what they're trying to pay for. And I'm not trying to be crass about that or political. I'm just saying they've been very open. Both sides of the political aisle have been very open about that being the objective of this particular policy. So
great.
Yeah.
Do you want to take one more question? Because we have a few more
let's do it.
So we can jam.
I'll do it.
So I think these are two questions that can maybe be combined. So the question is, if I don't have payroll because I'm a sole proprietor, I just draw on my account, can I apply? And also, I don't have an accountant, can I still apply for PPP?
Yes and yes, right? So the easy way of saying it is, you don't need an accountant. You might need some help in terms of figuring out the forms, but definitely you do not need to have an accountant. If you don't have a payroll system, if you don't have a business account, you can still do it. Again, what I would say is, and what we were recommending providers do in New Jersey is, write a check to yourself during the forgiveness period. Like even if it's, like in Tom's example, you're making $200 a week, Natalie writes a check to herself from her own account. It never leaves the personal banking account. But at least you have something that's date stamped that says, I was doing this formally and paying myself formally. So if you're the kind of provider, like some of the ones we heard in New Jersey, says, well, I wait to see my savings go up and then I pay me. So it might be this month, it might be 6 months from now. Don't do that. This is a time where you want to do it regularly, even if you're recycling that money.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gary. This was incredibly informative. Yeah, and again, encourage you all to take a look at the toolkit, to invite your providers and other staff to join us for the webinars that we have planned for next week, and really hope that you can support providers in accessing this important support. So thank you so much, Gary.
My pleasure. And as mentioned, this is a real passion. I'm so glad you're doing this because they need the help, and I hope many of you out there do help your providers.
Great. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I know there's just a ton going on and a lot of competing interests and concerns. So thank you for joining us this afternoon, and take very good care. Thank you.